Well, howdy, boys and girls. We are down to the stretch run. Just a couple more days for you here at King. Hope everyone is having a good, you know, graduation time period. I know it's a weird one. I know there's probably some things that you didn't get to do or whatever, but I hope you've still had a good time, and obviously, best wishes to everyone going forward. Today's going to be the last day that's an actual econ lesson. Tomorrow I'll have one more for you because I'm supposed to give you some work tomorrow, but it's actually going to be a little bit more of some life advice stuff that I normally give senior classes when I have them in class most of the time. I figure I'll just go ahead and do one like that for you. But today will be the last day we're actually really talking about like money stuff. And my bad, I meant to spend a lot more time on this section. But I'll be honest, I kind of lost track of where we were in the school year because, I could hardly keep track of what day a day is most of these days. So anyway, today we're gonna hit this whole section in the back on personal finance, and I'm going to try to keep it brief on each of these topics and just hit the highlights. Some of these things we'll just have to leave for your parents to explain to you, but we'll try to give you focus on the important things. So the first one, page 574 in your book, if you want to go along. And I would go ahead and take a look at this back section of the book before you turn your textbook back in. I know that sounds weird to say, but there's actually some pretty good advice in here for getting started, because a lot of y'all, may be at home for a couple more years, but a lot of you are leaving in the fall and, kind of starting out on your own. And so because of that, there's some things that you want to learn as you're doing that. So one of the first things they talk about here is the importance of having a monthly budget. And all that means by a budget is having your expenses broken out and sort of having a sense of how much you have available to spend on each thing. And it's good to have some kind of budget, at least in your head. Most people, it's going to be better to actually have it written out and be a little firmer about it, because I know sometimes the wind is fixing to knock my studio over here. Because I know sometimes there's a tendency to see if you've, especially like right after you just got paid, especially like at most of my jobs I've had before, I got paid every week or every 2 weeks. Here I get paid, once a month. And so, if it happens to be, a couple days after the last Friday of the month, I look at my bank account and I look like I'm living like a king, because I've got an entire month's salary sitting right there. And when you look at it like that, you can be like, oh man, how many steaks do I want to get tonight? Right? And so you kind of think you got it all, and then you go eat out 2 or 3 times, and then you look and you're like, oh crud, after I pay all these bills and pay this mortgage payment and take care of this and do figure out this gas for this trip I was going to do, before you know it, I got nothing else to use. Don't have anything to put in savings or anything like that. And you don't want to have that happen to you all the time, because that kind of helps set you up for bad financial situations. So you want to have a good sense of how much you're spending on each thing, and you have to have a realistic one. If you give yourself a $100 grocery budget for the month, I really hope you like ramen noodles and hot dogs. Now that may be what you have to do, right? When you're starting out, you may have, you may have a really tight budget and just have to learn how to eat a little bit below mama's cooking, right? But at the same time, you don't want to set a budget where you're going to be driven mad by stuff like that. But you also do want to make sure that you are setting up a budget that prepares you for the future, that allows for a little bit of savings, that allows for a little bit of investment. It's generally good. It's a really sad thing. People say that, I think it's something like 65% of Americans are not prepared to handle a $400 emergency, which, I am right now, but there's been most of my life I haven't necessarily been able to do that at the drop of a hat. That's kind of a bad thing, because if you have to go to the hospital for something, even for a night, it's going to be a lot more than that. If you have a car accident or something goes wrong in your car, it's even some minor car trouble can start pushing that limit at times. So you want to be able to have a little bit of money ready to handle an emergency, if one comes, and not be taken surprise. The fact that people haven't saved for emergencies is why a lot of people are hurting right now, because, when you see, it's one thing for businesses to be closed for 6 weeks and then they're having trouble, but a lot of these businesses that have closed in the last couple months closed within the first 2 weeks. Just having 2 weeks of no business was enough to put them out, and that's probably a sign that they were not putting enough away in the first place. But again, you have to figure out what your needs are, because you can't save money that you need now, which is why you don't want to make the mistake of buying things that are too expensive for you. To me, don't worry about getting a nice car until you're doing very well for yourself. Just get a car that'll get you around, because there's no sense in you having to change like what you do in terms of your career and how many hours you work. And especially once you get married, have kids, you're trying to, you're away from them, working overtime, trying to pay payments down on a truck payment because you wanted, a really fancy truck instead of one that was functional, that was half the cost. You just don't, think smart. Don't be materialistic. Don't build your budget around trying to impress other people at a red light. Be practical. If as you have some time and build up some finances, you'll be able to, at some point in your future, hopefully, maybe, you never know, but hopefully you'll get the chance to eventually, get a, nicer car than your first one, or a nicer house than your first one. But don't, but be content with what you have. Don't make yourself a slave to a truck, or else you're going to wind up hating that truck more than you enjoyed it. So there's a couple things that you want to figure out when you set up a budget. The first thing is you want to figure out your income. You want to figure out your income, and don't base that off of what your contract says. Base it on your take-home pay, because your taxes are going to be taken out right away. It may work out some years that you have to pay extra taxes. A lot of times it may work out that you get a refund, but they do what they call withholding taxes, where the government takes your income tax at a certain rate, and then you can figure the adjustments and what rebates and so on you deserve at the, when you turn your taxes in every year. And so, but just, start your budget off of your take-home pay, not your pay on paper. So start with your after-tax money, and then, make sure, and then you can, you want to kind of track your expenses, see what realistically does a month of groceries look like, for instance. You want to categorize them in terms of importance. And look at page 575. It's got a good example of kind of a model budget. And one thing that you will quickly learn in adult world is that living costs money. The first time you're out of the house and all of a sudden the groceries stop mysteriously appearing on in the cabinet because your parents aren't bringing them home anymore, it's a little bit of a shock to the system how much it costs to just eat every day and get gas and do these sorts of things, or get health insurance, which I don't have right now, because these things really add up. So creating a budget, the first thing you want to do, you got to figure out your fixed expenses. Like right now, the mortgage on my house is $600. It's going to be $600 no matter what. So that's a number that doesn't have to move. So my budget has to begin with accounting for that $600. And the same thing with, my car insurance is like $75. So you got to figure that. So you got to add those numbers up in your head and start with them, because there's nothing you can do about them other than, get another house. So then there's things that you have to get, but you can spend wisely on. So for instance, your food budget, you have to eat, but there is a way that you could save a lot of money on your eating, right? So if you eat out all the time, even fast food, it's going to catch up with you. You'll if you look at, even buying, Okay, even buying a steak from Cones is a little expensive. It's like $12 for a piece of steak, right? But if you went to a restaurant and got that same piece of steak cooked for you, it's going to be somewhere between $17 and $22 before it comes out, and that's before you've tipped. Right, so just cooking cooking your own steak, any of that kind of stuff, the more you can cook at home, the cheaper it's going to be. Then you can, there's a world of difference financially sometimes in what kind of brand you buy. If you buy the high dollar ice cream versus the cheap ice cream, over time it's going to make a difference. Now, this is probably the weak spot of my budget because I'm kind of a food snob, so I can't make myself buy the great value of everything. I buy the great value of anything that I can, but there's just sometimes, like, if I'm going to eat ice cream, it has to be either Breyers or the Kroger kind, the private selection, which is the best. I don't make it out toward Aiken enough to eat it very often, but I'm a little picky about a few things, and I could probably shave $30-$40 off my food budget a month for sure if I would stop buying top shelf of certain foods, but. So there's things that you can just eat, that you can think wisely about and balance your priorities, because obviously you don't want to eat like a pauper for the rest of your life, and you may want to consider your health and how you eat, which makes it more expensive, and stuff like that. So but no, like, food is something that you have to have, but you can adjust how much you use it. And then there's another level of expense that is that you need to have you want to be setting aside a little bit for savings every month, is the third category. And then after you've saved a little, after you've, figured out how to affordably do the things that are variable that you have to, then that's where you can start to factor in, like, your really variable expenses, the really flexible, and the ones that you can really do with that, like, concert tickets or movie theater, or things like that. And honestly, like with food, I typically consider eating out as part of, like, my entertainment budget. Like, I kind of set aside how much I'm going to spend on groceries, and when I eat out, I really kind of consider that part of my entertainment, because a lot of times when you're eating out, it's because you want to, go visit with people or whatever. So, or spare yourself the inconvenience of having to cook something. So I really don't look at that as really being the food budget per se. I look at that almost as going to dinner, almost the same way I would look at going to the movies or something like that. But of course, the reality is the more you eat out, the more you can knock off that grocery budget too. So it kills two birds with one stone. But again, so build on the foundation of your, like, fixed expenses. Then figure out what you want to do for spending. Think what you want to do for savings. And I would add, again, going back to what we talked about the other day about trying to take a Christian view of finance, I would add in what you're going to do as far as giving. Obviously I would, you start with, the tithe of your church or whatever, but then you should probably be giving more too, to whether it's helping out less fortunate people or, whatever it is. You should, have a certain amount set aside that you're being generous with. And then after you've kind of laid those foundation stones, then you can determine, do I have enough money to go to this ball game? Do I have enough money to go do this or that? That can change. All right, so the next section talks about types of checking accounts. Don't need to know too much about that. Do know that there is a difference, obviously, between a checking and savings account. Checking account, you have access to your money immediately. Savings account, you kind of have to move it over. The difference is money that sits in savings accounts collects interest. And savings accounts usually have some sort of minimum balance. Checking accounts can too. But the reason that your savings accounts have minimum balance is because the bank is making money off of that, using that money that's stored up in a different way. Find out when you set up your first bank account, if you haven't already, find out what their minimum balance requirement is. I mean, some banks won't let you keep an account going if you drop below a certain dollar figure. Others you can sit at zero or negative for a few months before there's any problem. But you want to know what it is and what kind of account you have. Typically, one thing that you really, really want to avoid, this was the bane of my existence in the college years, is the overdraft. most banks have a pretty high fee if you spend money for things that you don't have. If you swipe your debit card one too many times and your bank account was zero and you lost track of it because you weren't balancing your checkbook right, and you go swipe the card and you buy something, there's a fee for that, and it's at Wells Fargo, I know it's $35, which is not cheap. I remember one time when I was in college, I took a road trip to go out to a conference, and I overdrafted at some point on the trip. I didn't know that. I wound up, the day that I overdrafted, I went to Burger King and got a hamburger. I filled up a tank of gas, and my sister downloaded a song, a 99-cent song, accidentally using my iTunes account instead of hers. So that was 3 overdrafts. So that was $35, $70. So that was $105 of bank fees to buy a terrible hamburger, one 99-cent song, and 1 tank of gas. So please avoid overdrafts. Learn from my young stupidity. You don't want the overdraft fee in your life. You can decide when you set up a bank account, they'll give you the opportunity to set it up probably in a couple ways. Some bank accounts you can set it up to where you can't overdraft so that you avoid a situation like what I just described. On the other hand, sometimes you want to be able to overdraft because let's say you're traveling and you are stuck with no gas, and you run out of gas on the side of the road out of state, and there's no way to overdraft your account. You're going to sit there a while. So there may be some situations where it's you want to be able to, just in case there's a true emergency like that. But make sure that's not a regular part of your life. Talked about the difference between an ATM and a debit card, and a credit card. So the distinguishing between a credit card, a debit card, and an ATM card. When you have a debit card, it is just like using a check. You take that thing and you just slide it, and it takes it right out of your checking account, just like a check, but it just does it a lot quicker. The credit card, though, and the ATM card lets you get stuff out, doesn't necessarily use it as money. But then you have the credit card, and the credit card is a different beast, which we will talk about that in just a moment. Saving and investing, you want to kind of know where you put your savings. There's a few different types of accounts you can put your savings into. Savings accounts will earn you interest, which is the price paid for the use of money. Remember, when you have a savings account, the bank is actually borrowing your money and making investments with it. So they pay you a percentage on the money that you let sit in your account because they're borrowing it. They have to have a certain amount on reserve. Remember that from the other week. But beyond that, they're putting it to use. But depending on what kind of account you get depends on how much interest. So your standard savings account pays you a very low rate of interest, but it's also pretty easy to get money out of savings. You just, nowadays you can just hop on your app, and go into online banking at least at a lot of banks anyway, my bank anyway, and you can just very quickly transfer almost everything you have up to your minimum bank account minimum over from savings to checking like that, and within a day it's going to clear. So a money market account pays a higher interest pays a higher interest amount and lets you have a limited number of checks, but it also has a higher minimum balance, so you have to keep more in there to keep using it. A certificate of deposit, or a CD, offers the highest interest rates, and it's one of the safest investments, but it's also a thing where you have to pay a penalty to get the money out before it matures. So it has a certain date that might be 20 years out before you get to it, and if you pull it out before then, you have to pay a fee to get it out, because that's like they're paying more interest because they're using more of that money because it's locked in there, so they know that they can invest more of it. It's really never too early to start investing, and it's never too early to start planning for retirement. One thing you got to think about is that interest compounds. So because of the idea of interest compounding, which means you get paid interest on how much sits in the account, and so the interest that you get paid in 2020, next year they're going to pay you, let's say the interest rate is 3%. Well, you put in $100, you get paid 3% interest this year. So going into next year, you're going to have $103 if you don't add anything else. Well, now they're going to give you 3% of 103. So like it builds over time. Well, if you're just making an annual contribution at a certain rate, every so often, let's try to remove something on the phone there, over time you're going to get paid interest rates on higher and higher amounts. And, and if you have enough stuff in your retirement accounts, you can wind up actually making some money over some time with interest. So, like we talked about earlier when we talked about the stock market, there's a trade-off between risk and return. The higher risk investment, the higher the return. The lower the risk, the lower the return. So a couple things that you want to do about investing. You want to start early. My dad worked in finance for years. He always said the worst mistake people make is waiting too late to start saving for their retirement. So starting early, excuse me, is a big thing. You want to take a disciplined approach to investment. Your book calls it the buy and hold strategy. So, excuse me. So, you don't just want to kind of flail around. You want to kind of hold on to your investments for a while and obviously buy low and sell high and all that stuff we talked about. And you want to make sure you diversify. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. If you invest everything you own, for instance, in the 1990s, there was a moment in time where it looked really smart to put everything you own in internet businesses. Well, then you get to the early 2000s, people realize that they've bet on all these the wrong horses in these internet companies, that there's not enough for all of them to go around that are trying to start up. And you have all these tech stocks just crash. And so, the same thing, if you had all your money invested in real estate before the 2008 real estate crisis, then you lost. I personally know several people who had millions of dollars invested in real estate and just lost it all. And they didn't really have other investments. So you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. You want to have a diversified portfolio. And that's why mutual funds and stuff are helpful. So some things you can invest in, stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. We've already talked about those things. Employer-sponsored retirement plans. There's 401k plans. Let workers invest money for retirement and defer taxes. So some money that you put in your 401k, you don't have to pay taxes on it until later on in life. It can be a tax deduction in the short run. Pension plans are controlled by employers. And then employers may fund employee retirement benefits through profit sharing or stock ownership. And then also there's something called an IRA, or an individual retirement account. Workers may invest money each year for retirement. They're tax deferred, and their contributions may be tax deductible in certain cases. Roth IRA contributions are not tax deductible but earn tax-free income. And then funds must be held until you're 59 and a half, with a handful of exceptions. So typically in IRAs, you can't really touch them until you're getting up to retirement age. All right, so types of credit. So credit is the practice of making a purchase now and paying for it in the future. And so the most obvious form of credit is a loan, which when you go get a loan, that's when you borrow money and you repay it typically with interest. Certainly if you go to the bank, you definitely will repay it with interest. Maybe you might get a loan from mom and pop that's that's interest free, but anyone else is going to charge you. And your parents might charge you too, depending on their personality type, right? So So a loan obviously is when you're given the money in the short run and expected to pay it back, usually with interest. And you have the cost of credit is called the finance charge, which is the total cost of the loan. So that is what you pay in interest and so on. And the amount of interest you pay on a loan depends on what they call the APR, which is the annual percentage rate, which is the amount of interest that is charged per year. Now, a lot of loans, like home loans, actually, a lot of them actually have like interest change by the day. So like when I closed on my house, we had a paperwork snafu because I had a co-signer that was out of state, and the letter didn't come quick enough from her, and it was a whole to-do. And so we wound up having to go back to the lawyer's house and like re-sign all the papers 2 weeks later, which was irritating because I had to initial like 75 pages of paperwork, and I, nearly had carpal tunnel by the end of the day. And the problem was, I didn't really realize the fact that the interest changed daily. I didn't understand quite how big of a deal it was, and so what I was told the first time that I went in to close was that I was going to walk out of there, being given like $600, and this was like actually like. I think I was working at this, maybe just stopped working at the 7-Eleven at the time. So $600 was a big, big deal to me, right? And I was so excited about the $600. I was almost excited about that as I was about finally finishing on the house. And so anyway, we get this 2-week delay before I can get back to the lawyer's office and redo all the paperwork. And this time, not only did I not get the $600, I had to pay them like $100. So I'm like, where did this happen? And it was the interest had compounded, and of course that was a high interest rate because my house had been owner financed before we got the bank loan, and it's a long story. But so anyway, just so you know, interest can compound really quickly on some of these things. But the APR is the annual percentage rate. And that's the so if you get a car loan or something and it says 5% APR, that means 5% of interest is added to the loan every year. How easy it is for you to get a loan and the interest rates at which you get those loans are directly related to your credit, which is quantified in a credit score. And the credit score has a range of numbers that are kind of in the hundreds. If you get up to like 700 or so, you're like doing really well. If you're down in the 500s, you're questionable if you'll get the loan. If you're down in the 3s and 4s, you ain't getting nothing. So there's, how do lenders decide if you can get credit? So there's 3 basic criteria that they use: character, capacity, and capital. So character is your past record of paying bills on time. Any time that you are late on a bill, if it's a bill that reports to a credit agency, and many of your bills will, that has the chance of marking down your credit score. They want to see if you can live within your means, so that factors into like the percentage of your available credit. If you've got $1,500 credit available to you and you use $1,200 of it, your credit score is not going to be very good, because the idea is they're really maxing out what they've got. All these people that have multiple credit cards that are that are using most of them, if they've got 3 different credit cards and 2 of them are maxed out, their credit scores are going to be terrible, right? So they want you to prove that you can use a little credit and borrow a little money and pay it back. If you don't, the problem I ran into when I first started to buy a house was that I had only paid cash for stuff. I think my first car I paid off. I think I had just saved a lot of money, and then Dad chipped in some. We kind of split the cost and paid cash for it. It was used. So I'd never really made a payment, because I've literally never paid a car payment once in my life. I've only, either been given the car or paid cash for it, And so I literally just never used any. So I didn't have enough credit to get a house because I had to prove that I could borrow money, which is insane. You'd think that would be a good thing. It sounds like a good thing to me. I've never had to borrow money before, but they didn't like it. So what I wound up doing, and this is a great piece of advice to file away. If I had a son who was your age, this is what I would tell him to do: is go get a credit card, get 1 tank of gas on it once a month, and then put it away and never look at it again. And actually Joe's Uncle Harvey was helping me buy the house, and he was the realtor, and he told me, he said this is what you do to build up your credit score, because they worked out a way where I could owner finance the house for a year. He said, while you're doing that, every month you just use your credit card 1 time, put it away. He said your credit score is going to go up. You'll be good to go in 12 months. And he was right. So if I were you, I would go get a credit card. I'd put 1 tank of gas on it once a month and never use it again. And that way you'd show that you're using a very small amount of your credit, living within and then paying it off immediately. Don't ever let the card balance go past, never get charged interest on it. Pay it off as soon as you use it. So character is one, your ability to pay the bills and all that. The second thing is capacity. Your credit is going to be partly determined on if you're over leveraged already, it's going to be harder to get other loans. If you're trying to get a house, or some other large loan like that, you have to prove that you have a certain amount of income. You may be convinced, you may be convinced that you can actually make the mortgage payment, but if you don't have the type of steady income that you can prove to the bank, you're not going to get any help from them. And obviously, it's virtually impossible to buy your first house, in cash. So, really, unless you're truly wealthy. And then the last thing is going to be your capital, which is your incomes, your savings, your other investments. The more money you have in the bank, the more likely you are to get a loan. Now, this is this weird irony that the people that need money the most are the ones that can't get it. If you're like, anyone will loan money to a rich person because there's a really good chance of them getting paid back. The problem is the rich person doesn't need it as often. So it seems a little unfair, but from the bank's perspective, it's a much safer investment to loan money to someone who you know is good for it than someone who isn't. And so what happens is if you are deficient in any of these categories, your credit score is going to go down. And depending on your credit score is going to depend the interest rate that you get on your car or house loan. It's going to depend whether you're given that loan in the first place or not. And there's certain qualifications you have to have in order to get those sorts of loans. I really was fortunate with the way things went with my house because I was moving from out of state, so my contract with my old job was coming to an end, and trying to find a job. Well, the problem with that is you have to be employed to get a house. And so I was like, I know I can come up with the payments between, the part-time work I'm doing, and my parents are going to help me a little bit, all this stuff, but you still have to be able to prove it to the bank. And so I actually had to go get a cosigner who's someone else. And what a cosigner is someone else who signs their name to the loan. So that if you can't pay it back, they're responsible for it. Now, it's very hard to get someone to co-sign for you because really co-signing is generally not a good thing to do. It has to be someone who really loves you because it's potentially very stupid on their part. Because if I was a slacker and, I got my godmother to co-sign on it with me, if I was a slacker and wasn't paying for this bad boy, then she'd be in a world of hurt. So, be very careful co-signing for anybody because you never know when it's going to come due. But, and some banks don't even let you do that anymore. Some of them still do. So credit cards are, consider them radioactive. Consider them dangerous. Have a little element of fear about using them. Use them like I just described, where you use them like once a month and put them away. I have one like sports app subscription for where this like Netflix type website where a lot of the big boxing matches are on now, that I put on my credit card, so it comes out $10 a month, and I pay it off way, and that kind of helps build the credits up further. But don't ever do the whole thing of like living beyond your means and putting a bunch of stuff on credit cards and just be like, well, I'll get paid in the next 3 months. Let me just go buy this, this sofa and this jet ski and this thing, and this, golf cart and this, that, and put it all on credit. That is a recipe to get yourself in a real heap of trouble. So you don't just go out and spend a bunch of money you don't have. With credit cards, you need to take the perspective of, one, it's there for emergencies, and then two, it's there for emergencies, and it's just another way of paying for things that you can pay back right away, because some credit cards do have like perks where you can like redeem using the cards for, whether it's for airline mileage or, different benefits like that. And it's fine to exploit those things if you were willing to pay everything back every month. But if you just start flippantly, you can just put a couple things on your credit card a month, and then if you don't do a good job of paying it back, you can look and like, oh crap, that's up to $600. It can happen really quickly. I've only experienced credit card debt for 2 small periods. One was when I was between jobs and I literally just didn't know another way to pay groceries, until King saved the day. Thank you, Mr. Gibson. And then number 2 was one time when I had a hot water heater go out on me unexpectedly. And honestly, if I didn't make some of my money from renting spare rooms out, I probably would have just sucked up the cold water for a little while. But I got to keep my customers happy, or else I'd lose a chunk of my income. So you've got. So I've had those 2 situations, and even in those 2 situations, which, I had a plan in both cases to get it, paid off within a few months. But even those 2 or 3 months, it was just the most frustrating thing, because you'd think you'd get ahead of it and you wouldn't. And so, I can't imagine the people that just spend and spend and spend on credit cards and then have to figure out a way to pay it back while still feeding themselves and trying to make their new payments. That's the thing. And even with this stuff where all these people would say, oh, we're deferring rent payments for a few months because of the coronavirus, well, you better still keep paying and still budget that stuff to pay it off, because they can defer it for 3 months, but then guess what? They're going to want 4 months rent in 3 months so you got to make sure that you keep your payments current and don't spend more than you have. It's that simple. You're not the government. You can't go print more money and then stick everyone else with the inflation like the feds like to do. You have to actually spend less money than you make. Some things to consider with credit cards. Some of them have annual fees. They have different interest rates. Some have different grace periods between when you use it and when it comes due. And they all have different credit limits. Some of them may also have different bonuses. Your credit score is tracked by 3 companies, TransUnion, Experian, and Equifax. The thing is, they have a file on all of us without our permission. We didn't have to go to TransUnion or Equifax or Experian and say, start a file on me. They did it already using data from the time you put your name on the DirecTV, from the time you took out the car loan, all this stuff. You already have a credit score. You don't have to make one happen. It's there. Those 3 companies do it for the lenders, for the banks. And I am a little uncomfortable with that, to be quite honest, especially since one of them, I can't remember if it was Experian or Equifax, it was one of the 2. One of them had this huge thing where some Chinese company or something hacked them and got the credit information of 100 million Americans in the hack. So I'm not a fan of this system, but it is the way that it works. And so you have to pay attention to your credit scores. Another little adventure I had in the course of buying the castle over here is that, my dad had been in some debt for a time that he'd had to have a surgery. And because we had the same first name, it got stuck on my credit score. And so it had me as being in all this debt for the surgery I never had. And thankfully I was able to get that ironed out with a little less work than I was expecting, but it's still, even that was frustrating. So you want to, as early as you can, you want to get a look at your credit score and see what it's saying. And your credit score is affected by things like how many lines of credit you have out, how much credit you're using. You want to have used some credit. You don't want to have used much of it. How much, your credit score suffers also. Be very, very careful when you ask people to check your credit. Be very, very careful to specify whether they're doing what they call a hard or soft credit check. Because if they do a hard credit check, which is necessary for certain things, if they do a hard credit check on your credit, that is actually going to drive your score down, because companies don't like the idea of you shopping around for a whole bunch of loans, because it makes you look like you're desperate. So every time someone checks your credit, it goes down. So you want to be very, very careful with that. A lot of beginners will get screwed up with that. They'll do a whole bunch of credit checks trying to find the best deal or trying to find how different people perceive it, and it can mess them up. So make sure that you specify hard checks and soft checks. So the main thing to do, you want to build up a credit history, get a little bit of credit, and use it very, very wisely. Be careful about identity theft. This chapter is largely Some of this is behind the times because they've come up with more sophisticated ways of stealing your ID, but we'll skip that for the sake of time. But you do want to monitor and watch out. If you start noticing, always check your bank statements, because sometimes people will get a hold of your credit card number or parts of your ID, and they can charge you high dollar items, and then your money goes missing from you. And if you call, Visa and people like that are pretty good about spotting odd spending patterns on your cards, but you also want to keep an eye on that, because if you call and say that it's been stolen, they'll shut it down so that they won't spend any more of your money. Some wise customer decisions here, starting page 590. Some things to look for when buying a car. One thing to keep in mind about cars is cars depreciate rapidly. Especially if you buy a new car, because there's a huge difference in value between a new car and a used car, even if it's a lightly used car. So if you've got a brand new car and you buy it and you drive it home, and let's say you're 5 miles from the dealership, this car has only been used for 5 miles, but it already has lost a substantial percentage of its value. The resale value is already going to be less than you think. So if you buy a car, for $10,000 brand new, you're not going to be able to sell it for $10,000. So anytime you buy a car, you're going to lose money on the deal, unless you buy one pretty cheap, the first go around, unless you can find a real bargain on it to flip it. That's a depreciating asset. Houses and real estate typically go up in value. So, if you buy a patch of land, we'll talk about buying a house in a second. One of the advantages of buying a house is that, unlike rent, you can turn around and flip the house and wind up at least breaking even and possibly making a profit. A couple things to look for when buying a car. You want to figure out what kind of vehicle best suits your needs and budget. Be modest. Don't shoot for the sports car on the first go round. Later on, if you are being very successful in business and you want to upgrade to a sports car and knock yourself out, I'd still buy one used. Look up, there's something called the Blue Book value, which is the average resale. You kind of want to know what that is. Nowadays, it's easy to kind of get reports on the vehicle identification or VIN number on the car and kind of find out what it's been through. Look for signs of it having been in an accident. Check the odometer, especially if you're buying used cars. Take a test drive. Never buy something you haven't driven for most of the time. Make sure you get a mechanic that you trust to kind of look at it. Consider things like, like if you buy a 2-door car, or if you buy a 2-seater car, but you're about to get married, I would consider not doing that and buying a 4-door instead, or because you might have kids very soon and then have to swap that 2-seater out for a family car, and meanwhile that asset is depreciated. You might be able to get some of it back, but not all of it. So just keep all those things in mind when you're looking at a car. Financing your education, I would spend more time on this, but I'm sure we've already talked about this earlier in the year, and I know Miss Beedbo, different people have been working on you about FAFSA and all that stuff, so that's not news to you. Getting insurance, a couple terms you want to know about insurance is here on page 596. A premium is the amount that you pay for insurance every month. That's your monthly fee. A deductible is the amount paid by the insured before the insurance company pays. So if you get health insurance and you have a $60 deductible, they're not going to pay for anything that's less than $60. But let's say that the surgery, which 60 is very low for that, but let's say that the surgery is $100, which again is probably pretty low, but I guess it'll really be in the thousands, but I'm just using with numbers that are easy because I'm bad at math. So let's say you had a $60 deductible and a $100 bill. They would pay the $40, but you would have to pay the $60. A copay is the amount due when the insured receives care. With a copay, so if you had a $60 deductible and a $20 copay, so that is every time you use the insurance, you're going to have to pay $20. So now they're down to only covering $20 of it, right? I'm just making these numbers up. And then a claim is a request for payment on an insured loss. So if you're driving and your car gets hit and you go to your car insurance company and say, hey, you need to pay up, that's what they call a claim. That's where you file, and you're going to have to do things to prove that you were in the accident, that it wasn't your fault, and so on. And your driving record is going to have a big impact on the rate you get for car insurance. So make sure that you don't drive like a wild man and start going 95 miles an hour, because you think you're Superman because you have a car for the first time. Because if the more tickets you get, the more especially the more points you get on your record, specifically, the more your cost is going to go up. It's already more expensive to get car insurance when you're younger. Car insurance gets cheaper as you go along, as you put in more and more years without accidents. But the thing is, if you file one claim that's your fault, your car insurance is going to go up every month. Your insurance is also going to change based on the nature of the vehicle. And even stuff like the color of the vehicle can make an impact on that because, for instance, it's just been proven that red sports cars get in more accidents than, brown sedans. So, and some of that is the personality of the people that drive them. Some of that is it's easier for police to notice that they're speeding and give them tickets, et cetera, et cetera. But, contracts, always read the fine print. Don't ever sign your name to a contract unless you've looked really, really closely at what it says. I saw a Corny Church sign one time. It says, Adam and Eve, the first people not to read the Apple terms of services. Okay. Getting a job, you want to get a strong resume. And there's a lot of places that you can go that kind of show you good sample resumes. There's a decent example of a sample resume on page 601. You want to write a resume that puts you in the best possible light. I'm always a little awkward writing resumes because I feel like I'm bragging more than I feel comfortable with, but that's what you're supposed to do. So make sure that you don't have typos and stuff on your resume, because you may be entirely competent in every area except for spelling, but if spelling is the only thing the boss knows about you as he's looking through the stacks of resumes, then he is going to see that and be like, okay, this guy's an idiot, and throw it out. So make sure that you have proofread your resume over and over and over again. Get good references. Job interviews, come and dress nice. Don't dress like this, right? I came to my job interview, the nicest shirt I had, tie, the whole deal, dress shoes, the whole 9 yards. You want to make it look like you really care about getting the job. Paying taxes, a 1040 is the form you use to kind of fill out to figure out how much you owe. You'll fill that out using something called a W-2 that you get from your employer that shows you how much you gain from them. Obviously, if you're self-employed, the situations can be a little more complicated, but y'all can look into that. Finding an apartment. Well, this is one last thing we'll do. I'll try to get this done in 5 or 6 minutes here, but so finding an apartment or a house because many of you are going out on your own. Some of you may be living in dorms for periods of time in college. But then some of you may say, hey, I want to get an apartment off campus, or I want to get my own place, or what have you. So thinking through that, your housing expenses should be no more than 1/4 to 1/3 of your take-home pay. So whatever money is coming through your hands, don't spend more than 25 to 33% of it on housing expenses, which can be your rent or mortgage, but also the things that go along with it, like utilities. If you've got rent, but you also have to pay electricity or a few other things, then your housing expense is a little more than your rent. But you don't want to have much more than that. If you're having to spend half of your income on where you're living, you're not really going to have anything for spending, for eating, for saving. So make sure that it's reasonable. Understand this, that especially because I'm talking to private school students, so you're all at least middle class, and many of you, your parents are well-to-do. So with that being the case, don't forget that you're not starting out where your parents started off, right? You may have certain advantages, and they might be able to help you, or you might be able to get into a different school because of that. But they've been working for decades to get to the house that they have. So, the first house you buy, there's a very good chance that it's going to be something more modest than what you grew up in. You've just kind of got to get used to that. I read all these newspaper articles about, millennials can't afford houses. Well, the reality is some of that is because they're expecting a house like their parents' house, and I dealt with that a little bit too, because the houses I grew up in were a little nicer than than the one I have now. But my house is also a lot nicer than I was expecting for my first house. So I was actually expecting to start out a little lower on the scale, but I got a good deal on this one. But so make sure that you're not spending too much money. One thing that I like to say, if you know you're going to be living in a place for a long time, or you're reasonably certain, I think buying is oftentimes smarter than renting. If you know you're going to be up and around and you prize mobility, then rent, because there's no guarantee that you sell your house off per se. I know people that have moved, bought their new house before they sold their old one, and then they couldn't sell their old one as quickly as they thought, and so then they're trying to make 2 mortgage payments, and that gets really frustrating. Sometimes impossible. And the thing is, if you sink a bunch of money into a house and then it gets repossessed, you lost everything you sank into it. However, the same thing goes with rent. Because here's the thing: when you pay rent, that money disappears. It goes out of your paycheck, and there's no way to ever get it back. And the reason I bought a house, because when I moved here, I didn't know how long I was going to live here. I thought I was going to start by trying to find a place to rent. Everywhere I found that for rent, that I could find a house for rent was, above what I wound up paying in a mortgage situation. So some of the houses were renting for $700-800. And did the math and figured out that a mortgage payment would be between $550 and $600 for something like this. I mean, I could have bought some houses. There's a couple houses I could have bought that were cheaper than this that I could have been paying $340 $400 for. And the thing is, every bit of that I pay a month, so I'm actually paying less per month than if I'd have rented some of the more expensive houses. And then when I move, if I ever do, then if I sell the house, I can get all of that back, if I get equal value to what I have. And as long as I keep the house up, you expect you should be able to most of the time. So, you're losing the same amount of money per month, but then you have a chance of getting a little bit of a windfall if you ever sell it. And when you do get a house, when you do get a mortgage, do be aware, as the wind nearly destroys my recording studio again here, do be aware that you're hardly touching the principal. If you get a 30-year mortgage, which is the standard, that house is not going to be free and clear yours for 30 years. Even then, it's not going to really be free and clear yours, because you're going to have to pay property taxes on it. Which sometimes makes it hard for retirees and stuff to keep their houses, because they'll have bought the house and then they can't keep up with the taxes, especially as the value of the house goes up. But a home is an asset that appreciates. A lot of times, if you can keep a house up and improve it and put new things in it, replace the flooring every so many years, replace the septic tank every so many years, all that kind of stuff, which, by the way, being a homeowner you do wind up sinking a bunch of things into stuff like that. But eventually when you sell, if that stuff is current, you often get a pretty good price for it. The advantage that renting has over buying, one, it's a lot easier to quit. You might have signed a year lease, you might have signed a by the month lease. You can just go somewhere else if you don't like where you're at. If you buy a house and you don't like it, you're kind of stuck there. So that's one thing. But also, if you're renting, the landlord, some people get stuck with bad landlords and can't get stuff taken care of. But a lot of times, the landlords will take care of if there's a problem with the washing machine, as opposed to I have to go to figure out a way to buy a new washing machine, which I wasn't expecting, wasn't budgeting for, So those sorts of things are things you got to think about. And some things you want to consider, space. You want to have a house that's big enough for your needs. If you're trying to do a thing with like 3 or 4 roommates and you're trying to get like a 2-bedroom house, that's going to get crowded after a while. You're going to start hating each other, after a year or two, if not sooner. So you want to make sure everyone who's trying to live there has space. You want to make sure it suits your needs. Like, to me, it was really important to get a house with a yard. I didn't want to live in like one of these cramped little subdivisions where you barely have any property, So, but those priorities are different for different people. You want to consider the locations, if you're if you want to think about getting something that's semi close to your work and that sort of thing, because your commute is a big part of your lifestyle, and determines how much you have to pay in gas, plus how much time you'll end up wasting. You want to consider, is the neighborhood safe, all that sort of stuff. Um, it talks about here, the section here, should I live by myself or with roommates? That's a lot of that is going to depend on your personal preference. One thing that's nice about if I was ever going to be in a situation with roommates, which I have had roommates for several years now, you want to be the one who's responsible for everything, because you don't want someone else to be in charge and they are supposed to pay the rent and they don't, and then you lose your house over it. That would be stupid. So it's better to own the place and rent out the spare room than to be renting out the spare room from the person who owns it, in my view. But you want to be careful, because the whole renting space thing is a great way to get some of your money back. Right now I only have one roommate. I've had periods where I've had 2 and 3 at a time, and I was actually making a profit over my mortgage payment every month in the space I sublet. So that can be nice. On the other hand, you do want to remember that it is your life, and you don't want to be surrounded by people you can't stand. So you want to make sure it's people that you can get along with. Even though you may not see each other as much as you think, you don't want people who are irritating you that you can't get away from. One time I made the mistake of accepting a roommate sight unseen who I had never met, who was moving into town. It turned out to be this really weird Russian guy, and it was just some terrible things that happened. The one guy, so one day, I've got, my bedroom is connected to the study that you've seen me do the videos on in front of the books. It's kind of a suite type thing. And so that study room, the library room, I kind of consider it a part of my bedroom, even though it's technically not, because they interlink, And so I let this Russian guy stay there for a couple months, just because I thought it'd be, just some quick bucks. I mean, hey, why not make 400 extra bucks a month, right? So I made a bad decision. I should have just given him his $1,200 back and not let him stay, because he was driving me crazy. But so it's 10 o'clock. I'm asleep, and it's a Saturday morning. I'm sleeping in. It was and all of a sudden I look, and he's sitting in the library room, which I really consider a part of my room, with some sort of mat. I don't know if he's doing yoga or what he was doing. I'm like, dude, what are you doing? I'm still in bed. What are you doing in my room? He's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm like, what? So, just things like that. One time, he was always. One time I was fixing to go to bed. It was 10 o'clock at night. I was reading. He walks in, and I'd left the TV on in the living room, and he comes in and he says, are you done with the television? I was like, yeah, sure, man. You just watch whatever you want. He's like, oh no, I was just making sure to turn the power off. We had just had a smaller than usual power bill come in. He said, perhaps the reason the power bill is down is because I am now here to turn the lights off. And I wanted to get up out of the bed and run and strangle the guy to death. So you just don't let strangers live in your house. I think I've probably told you the story about the one axe murderer that my parents invited into the house for a little while there. I think I've told you all that one at one point in time. If I haven't, you'll have to remind me to tell you sometime, because I know we're pushing the hour mark here. But anyway, so just be careful. Just be careful with the roommate situation. Make sure that you get people that are sane, and preferably not axe murderers. But anyway, so those are just some basic financial things. I think this lesson will probably help you a lot more than the one on the Federal Reserve did. So I would actually look, before you turn your textbook in, look over that back section that's on the personal consumer finance, because there's actually some stuff that I think would be helpful for you. So anyway, I will see you soon. The next time you see my face on here will kind of be my farewell speech in lieu of being able to go to your graduation. And then, who knows? I was talking with somebody the other day. I'm thinking, if we get into June or so and things are a little more back to normal, since y'all missed on a bunch of stuff, maybe we could have a reunion cookout at my house or something like that. So who knows? I'll try to keep in touch with y'all after everyone gets out here. But y'all have yourselves a good day, and happy graduating.